the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and some of the responses back in terms of limiting Russia's access to SWIFT and sort of free currency trading and stuff like that has really caused a lot of the world to sort of reconsider what the U.S. dollar does represent. In simple words, the U.S. dollar, some would say, has been weaponized through this process. And so you've got a number of countries around the world, Canada included, that of course hold substantive U.S. dollar holdings in their central bank reserves in order to provide that stability. And I don't care whether you're friendly with the United States or not friendly or anywhere in the spectrum. Central bank reserves are sort of the core value, the core backup for every country out there. And what you want with those reserves is you want to make sure that you maintain diversity and you want to limit risk. And I think what we're seeing here is that a lot of central banks around the world have watched what happened and are perhaps a little bit more nervous about the amount of US dollars that they've got in those central bank reserves. And they're now exploring the concept of truly building that stability. And this is what we've always, we know society has shown this continued. Gold is a constant store of value. It's abject of any type of political interference or influence. It's always provided that for society. It always will provide that for society. And so, I think that's what we're seeing is we're just seeing a lot of central bank movement where we're starting to question, should we be so, should a lot of these central banks be so heavily weighted towards US dollar backed reserves? And perhaps it's time to start shifting into, healthy, apolitical alternative, gold, something that can't be manipulated and can't be weaponized by any future governments. And so, I think it was almost to be expected when we saw what happened earlier on this year.
Absolutely. I think that's well said. And, the top five really remain the top five. That's unchanged. U.S. still in first place. But what is interesting is that Turkey, Uzbekistan, and Qatar emerged as the biggest known buyers. Does that surprise you? Do these three surprise you, Randy?
No, I think that those three countries are countries that are really trying to establish their own strength within their own reserve currencies, and so I think it's just a reflection. And I know there's a lot of other buying going on that isn't necessarily getting reported. There are a few countries out there that don't report. I know Russia has sort of changed their stance, and they now consider it a state secret, and they won't report what they hold for gold. And I'm sure we're seeing that a bit on a bit broader basis.
Well, this is the big story, right? Who are the mystery buyers? We know that China and Russia have been buying and hoarding gold. But before we talk about this, can you give us some insights about how the World Gold Council collects this information? Is there a regulatory body that can enforce gold disclosure holdings?
No, there isn't. That's one of the advantages of gold is the fact that it is there isn't a regulatory body. It's a universal commodity that's widely accepted as that measure of value, as that store of value. And there is no, the IMF, of course, tends to be the main regulating authority in terms of, asking for this information, but there's no forced requirement for members of the International Monetary Fund to actually deliver back that information in. It's a request, but it's not a requirement. So most of the information that we pull at the World Gold Council does come from IMF filings. We of course have a division at the World Gold Council that does focus on providing education to central bankers, the actual people that work at these central banks, to try and educate them about the strengths and the benefits of having gold in those portfolios. So we do have good, strong relations with most of the central banks around the world from that perspective. But when it comes to the filings, it's generally we pull most of our information out of the IMF.
I would think that, you see the U.S. as the number one central bank gold holder. It's a sign of power. So why wouldn't China want to show that maybe they do have more gold than the U.S.?
I agree, totally. I think that anyone that wants to try and compete with the US dollar as a central reserve currency has to look at what backs that US dollar. And it's no coincidence that our main reserve currency around the world, the strongest of the fiat currencies, is the US dollar. But there's, it's no coincidence the fact that it's also got the highest level of gold backing that US dollar. And so people look at that as a sign of strength in terms of how are we going to compete against that US dollar. And so obviously different competing economic circles, they're doing their best to try and find a way down that path.
And is it correct, Randy, to say that whatever is mined in China tends to stay in China? So that's why it's so hard to even guess a number, because whatever they're mining stays in the country?
Yeah, exactly right. China and India are the two biggest consumers on an overall basis in terms of that's where most of the gold goes in today's world in trading. And so both India and China, India's got a very strong retail and jewelry trade, of course, and there is a lot of export out on that front. But with respect to China and India, even with the gold production in those countries, and specifically China, which does have healthy gold production in country, they are still a net consumer and net importer of gold. And so anything that's produced in the country doesn't leave.
The reason I find the timing of this so interesting is I just interviewed Frank Giustra, who I know you know very well. And in the interview, he brought up the thesis and his theory that China has been hoarding gold this whole time because they're planning to release some sort of gold-backed currency as a competitor to the US dollar. What do you make, and I'm sure this is not the first time you've heard of this theory. What do you make of this?
Well, I can tell you that the World Gold Council has an initiative right now pushing down that path to digitalize gold. It's called the Gold 247, or 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is what it stands for. Gold 247 initiative. And really what we're striving towards is to try and make gold readily accessible through digital tokens, through, essentially, as I would say, I don't think there's actually been a real stable coin invented out there yet, but I think that we may be able to create the first ever real stable coin with real assets backing it. So the ultimate goal is to improve the accessibility, the transparency, the provenance, and the trust behind gold and moving gold around. And so we've got a pretty heavy initiative focused on trying to work with a broader group of the refiners, the banks, the traders, to come up with a system that is gold backed and allows us to move gold around quickly, freely, with confidence, with trust, and with transparency, and actually ultimately provide gold as an alternative to the US dollar. If you look around the world right now, the US dollar is by far the strongest currency. We're all looking at commodity prices and all sorts of, and ruining it. But if you start looking at perhaps the price of gold in, say, pounds or euros or other currencies around the world, it's actually doing okay. We've got an incredibly strong US dollar environment out there, and there's no real alternatives. And so I'm sure there's all sorts of groups. China, definitely would love to come up with an alternative to the US dollar as being the strongest of the fiat currencies. We think it's time for gold to actually step up and become an alternative. It's not a fiat. It's actually got real value behind it. And so there's a real strong initiative being put forth by the World Gold Council right now. And we're hoping that within the next year, we will have a platform that will come out and allow digital gold to be traded freely and easily and rapidly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, ultimately to be used as a currency.